the financial markets. Those low interest rates, in turn, made it very cheap for people to borrow, made it very cheap to buy houses, caused this housing boom, or at least accentuated the housing boom. The search for yield we talk about, that people tried to find better interest rates by taking on more risk, caused by those 1% interest rates. All the things that we know from the study of monetary history over the years, which result from monetary excesses, occurred. The booms that we saw, the housing prices rising very rapidly, until ultimately they couldn't rise any more rapidly throughout the country. We saw the inevitable bust, the foreclosures, the defaults, and more generally, and the troubles in the financial system. So basically, this crisis was stimulated by easy money, excess money. And there's various ways you can prove that. You can just look at the interest rates being so low. They never hold that low during the period of the good period of most of the 80s and 90s. So is it really excess by any way you measure? A million ways to measure it. And for my money, that was really the ultimate beginning of this problem. There's other things you can mention. Actually, frequently there are government policies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac being encouraged to buy high-risk mortgages by our government. Of course, the origination of mortgages that shouldn't have been given to people and then sold off to financial institutions who didn't know how risky they were. But ultimately, you had to have those very low interest rates to get it moving, if you like, to make this crisis as serious as it really turned out to be. So that's my number one on my list of things that are part of this great deviation. I might say that not everybody agrees with me on the first item on the list, in particular Alan Greenspan, who was in charge of the Federal Reserve most of the year. Truth is, I know Alan Greenspan very well. I worked with him in his old firm in New York, worked with him in President Ford's Council of Economic Advisors when I was on the staff, and of course was a colleague in the government at the time. He was chairman of the Fed. I was at the Treasury. So we talked about this enormous amount. He disagrees and has written extensively about it, but I think maybe I'm going to convince him before too long. The other person who disagrees with me, not surprisingly, is the current chairman of the Federal Reserve. So it's not bad when you're trying to get out there and get a little publicity for your work when the chairman, current chairman, and the former chairman of the Federal Reserve write that you're wrong. But I think in this case, in both cases, I've got more people on my side for what it's worth. Too bad we weren't running for election on this view, but it seems like it's hanging together. Okay, so that's number one. Perhaps that's the hardest one to explain because monetary policy is always arcane. We just think of it as too low interest rates, too much money, causing a speculative boom, which couldn't last forever, had to come down, and when it came down, we had this crash in the financial system, which then accentuated, in many ways, the problems that were there already. Number two on my list, we now, and I'll come to it in a minute, think this Stimulus Act of 2009 was a mistake. I think it was a mistake. Didn't seem to stimulate the economy. I'll go back to that in a minute. The number two on my list is not that Stimulus Act. And it goes to Floyd's point about trying to be nonpartisan when you look at this. The next point on my list was the Stimulus Act passed and signed by George W. Bush in February of 2008. Some people forget about this, but this was actually the first Keynesian stimulus package that went through the Congress. It was before the recession got to be the Great Recession. And the idea, some of you may remember, was to send checks to people, send checks in the mail, and people would spend that money, and we'd jumpstart the economy. So you can look at the numbers, if you like, it's in my book, but just imagine this. You send checks to people, and then you look at the total amount of income people have in the whole economy. So income's going along, and then it blips up like that with the checks. It goes back down because the checks are finished. People got their money. Then you look at the people's consumption, and you say consumption's going on. Well, maybe that's going to blip up because people have all this income, and that's going to keep the economy from going into a recession or jumpstarting the economy. No. When you look at consumption, it doesn't budge. So income goes up, consumption just stays flat. If that has no impact, except that we borrowed another $150 billion to pay for this. Okay, so that's the first Stimulus Act. Now, the idea of having stimulus policies like this was popular actually when I was at school, called Keynesian stimulus packages after John Maynard Keynes. And through most of this, I'd say, good period, most of the 80s and 90s, those kinds of packages were shunned. It was viewed as kind of bad policy. It didn't work. It was something you didn't need to do, and in fact, we didn't do much of it. Can't remember any during that period. It's another reason why things worked pretty well. The economy grew. We didn't have these extra added interventions into the economy. Somehow that changed, and we had this intervention. Didn't do any good. In fact, just increased the debt. That's my second on the list, the Stimulus Act of 2008. Third on my list, and this is probably the worst because it has to do with the bailouts and the actions taken in 2008. So let me call this the on-again, off-again bailout policy, number 3. What do I mean by that? Well, when the financial crisis started getting serious, interest rates in the money markets shot up. Banks started charging each other a lot to lend and borrow. What we did was start to intervene with particular financial institutions. What I mean by we, I mean the Federal Reserve. So in the spring of 2008, a financial institution, Bear Stearns, looked like it was going to fail, and was concerned that it would spread to the rest of the markets. So instead of allowing it to go through bankruptcy, the Federal Reserve used its own money, actually it just prints money to do this, it's our money, printed money, to bail out the creditors, the people who had loaned money to Bear Stearns. So it was, at that point, a lot of money, $30 billion. And that was really the first of this. That was the Monaghan part that went ahead and did the bailout. So then you go through the year, Fannie and Freddie are in trouble, loans to Fannie and Freddie from the Fed, eventually those are taken over by the government. Then you go through, things haven't changed, not stabilized, a lot of uncertainty in the economy, and you come into September, and things look a little shaky at another firm, much like Bear Stearns in its size and business, Lehman Brothers. In this case, it was an off-again. Just decided not to use the funds of the Fed to bail out Lehman Brothers. They thought about it, but at the last minute changed their mind and didn't do it. A huge surprise to the markets, shook the markets up, so it was an off-again. Next day, AIG is bailed out, on again. And it goes on, and it's an off-again, because off-again, I'm going to use the TARP. So this on-again, off-again, on-again, off-again basically just created a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the markets. If you look at the worst part of the financial markets, it's actually in this period well after Lehman Brothers, when we roll out the so-called TARP, because the TARP was effectively the last straw of this bailout policy. When the TARP was introduced, I remember it very well, in September 23rd, 2008, Chairman of the Fed, Bernanke, Secretary of the Treasury, then Hank Paulson, go to Congress and say, we would like $750 billion. Here's 2.5 pages of notes, draft legislation about how we're going to use it. Congress was, American people, just amazingly surprised, and then the markets tanked. And part of the rationale given to do this policy was quite scary. It was, if you don't do this, we're going to have another Great Depression 2.0. So the markets were frightened. Stock markets fall. The S&P 500 falls by 30% in those 3 weeks. And there's a major panic, and it spreads around the world. Okay, so this is I think this is third on my list. On-again, off-again intervention, bailout policy. Some people say, well, if we hadn't done this, we would have had the Great Depression. In my view, the actions themselves brought us precariously close to the Great Depression. And it's an example of this great deviation policy, which is causing much more harm than good. Next on my list, yes, the 2009 stimulus package passed in February by President Obama. Now this is much bigger than the Bush ones, even the bailouts. It is got a little bit of that send money to people, hope they'll spend. I remember they called me actually and said, do you think we should have a stimulus package? I said, no, look what happened last year at this time.